Everybody, welcome to this episode of Parenting in Hindsight. I'm joined today by my daughter Maggie.
Hi.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about love and limits, why kids need both. But before we get started, I want to just make a bit of a disclaimer that discipline is a tough topic. Every child is different, every family is different, and what we're going to be talking about today is just what worked for our family, what didn't, and with the benefit of hindsight, looking back, kind of what resonated the most for both me as a parent and for Maggie as a child looking back. So I don't think any parent enjoys the part of the job of parenting called discipline, but it's something that comes with the territory of being a parent. And we all know sometimes it's easier to give in and say yes, but we know probably at the time, and certainly looking back in hindsight, that no was probably the better answer in many cases, but it's really hard to do. So that's why we thought this would be a great topic to share our experiences talking about with parents of today who are trying their best with young children. So Maggie, what are your thoughts on discipline kind of at a very high level looking back?
Discipline was probably something we received when we were not following directions or specifically saying or doing something harmful to anyone in our family or specifically like my sister. If I said something that wasn't very nice or maybe I gave her a little punch or something like that, that's when the discipline would come in, or maybe not sharing, but that goes back with listening to directions and following directions. So it was never something cruel or scary. Growing up in our family, discipline was more of an act to make sure that next time we learn from our mistakes and would do better.
Awesome. So looking back and maybe even trying to put yourself back as a child, did you think that we were strict?
I don't think super strict. I think strict enough. Bad things really stuck with me, but yeah, from being really young to all throughout high school, I would say about a good balance, a bit in between. I wouldn't call you very strict or not strict.
Okay, I think that's fair. Looking back at myself, I think that sounds pretty accurate. Were there rules that you thought were unfair?
I remember we got our phone at age 13, which at the time I thought was unfair. I wanted it way earlier. But other than that, no, I think all consequences or everything like that came at a fair and reasonable time, and they were deserved. So
looking back in hindsight, right? Did you ever compare Dad and me and how we disciplined you and your sister to like other parents and what you saw over at other people's houses?
I would say that you guys were not afraid to discipline me while I had friends over, which I don't think I really saw very often when I would be at my other friends' houses. For instance, one time when I was probably like between age like 5 and 8, we were sledding. We had a big hill in our backyard. We had a whole bunch of friends over. My sister and I both had friends over. And I think I like hit my sister with my sled or something that wasn't very nice. And you guys made me just go inside and sit at the window and watch all my other friends sled. And my friends didn't really know how to act because this was my house and I was inside, but they continued sledding. And I would say that wasn't really something that happened at other friends' houses. Like, I think if they would get in trouble, I would either have to leave or they would wait to maybe discipline their child until I left. So you guys were not afraid to really do the consequence as soon as the action happened, which is probably better because then like I still remembered it. It was still fresh in my mind. I knew why I was getting that consequence. And compared to some of my other friends, maybe as I got older, there were times where maybe my friend and I would both do something and her family would discipline her differently than my family, and there were times I'd be like, ooh, that stinks for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're missing out on this next event because you're grounded and I'm not. But then at separate time, maybe it would be in reverse and she'd look at me and that stinks for you. But overall, I think it was a pretty good balance.
I'm glad you brought up the sledding incident because I had kind of forgotten about that. But as soon as you brought it up, I remembered. And we had a screened-in porch that looked out on our backyard, and you had to sit on one of the chairs there because you were all bundled up. You were warm in your snow stuff. And I remember you sitting out there just watching, and I think it was about 15 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, I remember it.
That's great. Looking back in hindsight, was that appropriate?
Probably, and I never hit my sister with the sled again. And yeah, but it was painful, long 15 minutes.
Yeah. So We had a few family mantras that, before we jump into the whole discipline thing, we had a few family mantras that we said over and over again all the time, and we reinforced them. And the first one was use your problem solving skills. The second one, which this kind of goes to the discipline part, was finish what you start. And the third was have fun. But I want to zero in on the finish what you start one, because that's where I would say discipline in air quotes kind of came into play. It wasn't necessarily discipline as you would think of in the form of punishment by any sense of the imagination, but you weren't allowed to quit. So if you started something like piano lessons or gymnastics, you had to finish that period of time that you signed up for. You couldn't quit midstream. Do you remember that and how that may have impacted you?
Yeah, I remember hearing that mantra, and it's probably still something that kind of rings in the back of my head even today.
Finish what you start. Yeah, another thing that we said over and over again that we talked about when you were getting in trouble for something was represent your faith and family well. And so when you did something that we thought didn't represent your faith and family well, we would ask you that question. Maggie, did that represent your faith and family well? And then I think it hopefully caused you to be introspective and think about it.
Yeah, I think that specifically representing your family well really stuck with me when I would do something, especially out in public or at someone else's house, and knowing that the way you act is representing your parents, is representing your sister. If you can do this out in public, what can you do at home? And that's just a very important lesson to just hear. And if you wouldn't have said that, it's probably not something I would have thought about often, but it really does go back to how you're raised, what your family's values are, and how you're showing that to others.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that now, kind of looking back. And I think for families today, if that line is helpful for you to just share with your kids, think about what that means to represent your family well, so that you can set those expectations with your children while they're young. So the other thing that was really important to us as parents, to my husband and me, was consistency. And I think that's really where it helped us to discipline our children at the right times, because it was about being consistent in the way they acted and the way we disciplined. So when my kids were little, I had read an article in a parenting magazine that basically said, if you do something the same way 99 times in a row, and the 100th time you don't, you cave or you give in to your children's tantrum, you're back at the starting point. You're back at step one. And I remember thinking, I don't ever want to be in that position of doing something 99 times and then going back to zero. So that I always kept that in the back of my mind, to be consistent. So our goal wasn't to punish our kids, but to be consistent and to be predictable. So you knew what to expect, and we would kind of handle things in a similar fashion each time.
Yeah, I like that. And it goes back to what you were just saying about having like family values and being consistent with those values. So whether you have a family quote or mantra, or maybe you put things on a wall that these are your values, like you share, or you're polite, or you use your manners, and then the children know that that's the expectation always, and for everyone in the household, the parents and the kids, and everyone's really clear on that. And so then when you go against that or you break that, that's when you're not representing your family well, and that's when maybe some type of consequence or discipline could come in, just to make sure that next time they're doing that, and that is the expectation.
Awesome. So one of the parenting techniques that we used, and I see parents doing a lot in public, is counting to 3. So it's when I get to 3, if the child isn't doing what they're supposed to do, there's a consequence. And so I would say, Maggie, go clean up your room. 1, 2, 3. And if we got to 3, there was a swift and immediate consequence. And you mentioned the sledding, that there was an immediate consequence when you hit your sister with the sled, that we didn't wait till your friends went home, and then it's kind of lackluster at that point, or maybe we would even forget to issue the discipline. And I've seen so many parents in public saying, if I count to 3, and then they're 1, 2, 2.5, 2 3/4, 3, and then it's like you go into compromising mode.
So what were some things that if we got to 3 out in public you would do?
Great question. So one of the times that I remember most, which was super inconvenient for me, but I had to do it to be consistent and to kind of mean what I said, is you and your sister were like 2 and 4, and it was the summer, and we were going to the local community swimming pool. And so those of you with young kids know that it can be a challenge to take your children to the pool. So it's loading up the pool bag, getting snacks, getting drinks, getting the bathing suits on, getting the swim diapers on, getting the sunscreen on, everything you need, you know, your inflatable stuff blown up, getting everything loaded in the car with your stroller and the buckets and all that stuff. You know, it can take an hour to even get ready. Then you drive to the pool, unload everything from the car, get the kids in the stroller, wheel them in, and at our swimming pool there was this big hill that we had to go down to the kids' pool. Get everything unloaded, get the kids in the kids' pool, and somebody was misbehaving. I can't remember if it was you and your sister, but I said, if you don't knock it off, we're going home. And whoever it was didn't knock it off, and I said, look, we're going home if you don't stop. Didn't stop. And I said, come on, we're leaving. And you two were shocked that we were leaving. And there was like, you could hear a pin drop around the kids' pool because all the other moms were looking at me like, is she really leaving? She just got here. And they know the whole rigmarole it takes to get your kids to the pool. So got you out of the water, toweled you off, put you back in the stroller, collected all the stuff, back up the hill we went with the stroller, and we went home.
Wow.
And it was tough. I didn't want to leave. My friends were at the pool. I wanted to hang out with my friends. I wanted you to be entertained for the afternoon. Instead, we're coming home on a beautiful summer day to the inside of our house. But that was the last time somebody misbehaved to the pool because you knew I meant business.
Yeah. And then separately, some things around if we misbehaved at home, and we're talking about discipline and consequences and like what do we mean by that. I remember sitting in timeout or going and sitting on the stairs to go to our upstairs, which was also a timeout area, and just sitting there for a few minutes, and it just kind of let me like cool off. So if I'm rowdy and maybe I'm yelling back at you, I don't think I should be punished, and I have to go sit on the stairs. I remember probably for the first part of it, I'm just angry and frustrated and mad and think you're in the wrong and I'm in the right. And then eventually I can take a few breaths and calm down. And then I get like sad that I'm sitting in timeout, and then I just get back to excited to be with my friends. So then by the time that the time limit was up, I'm just ready to get back to what I was missing, and I understood that I made a mistake.
Yeah, and back to that point about the doing something 99 times, and if you cave, kids don't really want you to cave, because I would say that consistency builds trust, and it builds the trust and the expectation. So like we've been talking about, you knew what the consequences were going to be if you misbehaved or didn't represent your family well. So I'm glad you brought up the timeout situation, Maggie, because that was a really effective discipline tool for our family. So we literally called it the timeout stool, and it was this little kind of leather poof thing that we had in the corner of our kitchen. And I got this tip from a parenting magazine at the time, but the recommendation was for each year of age that the child is equals 1 minute of timeout. So if you're 3, you sit in the timeout stool for 3 minutes. And we had a little old school timer, digital timer right by the stool. And so when I counted to 3 and I got to 3, you would have to go to the timeout stool. And then if we were away from home in someone else's house, it was the stairs. So you mentioned the stairs. That's when you were on the stairs if we didn't have that timeout stool and we were at someone else's house. So we weren't afraid to discipline at someone else's house, which can be awkward and could be a little embarrassing. But again, it comes back to the consistency. So if your kids know that they can get away with misbehaving at friends' houses, they'll do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're 3, you're dealing with your, unformed brain at that point. And if you want a toy that a friend's playing with, you're going to grab it. So I'm glad that you remember that. Do you remember the timeout stool in our kitchen?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
One of my favorite stories about the timeout stool is it was so consistent and so kind of drilled into you all that that was going to be a consequence for misbehavior. That I remember one time you went over and took a toy from your sister or did something bad. You went over, snatched it, dropped it, and then walked yourself over to the timeout stool, set the timer, and sat down. And it was really hard not to laugh when you did that. But we were like, you deserve that. And, we had to kind of toughen up, even though we wanted to laugh, because it was just so ingrained in you that we're like, well, this is working. This is working. What would have happened, Maggie, if we threatened a consequence and then didn't deliver? Like, looking back, would you guys have taken advantage of that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, exactly. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? So, moving on to kind of a next topic, I want to talk about how discipline kind of matures as a child matures. So, discipline should transition as the child ages. So, when you've got a toddler and a preschooler, the consequence should be simple. So, taking away a toy, maybe taking away a blanket, going in the timeout stool if they're, I would say, beyond the age of 2. And then when they're in elementary school, I think it starts to get a little late for the timeout stool. When they're in first grade, second grade, you're not going to have them sitting there for 8, 9, 10 minutes in the timeout stool. But you can still take away a favorite possession, or you can also take away a potential reward. So I remember we were going to go out for ice cream after dinner as a family, and either you or your sister was not behaving, and we said, if you do this again, you're not going to get ice cream, and you did it again. And so the whole family still goes out for ice cream, but the misbehaving child has to sit there and watch the rest of the family get ice cream.
Yeah, that's tough.
It's really tough, and it's tough on the parents too, because that kid's likely going to throw a tantrum or a fuss at the ice cream place, or at the soft serve place, or Italian ice place, and it might be embarrassing, but
it wouldn't be fair for the other kids though who didn't act up, and then they don't get ice cream, and then everyone's in a bad mood. So
exactly, that's one thing we did not believe in punishing all for one child's misbehaving. So if one child misbehaves, you're not both going to get punished. And then in high school, I would say discipline is more about restricting or removing privileges. So they're often driving, middle and late high school. They might want to go to parties so you can do the grounding thing, hanging out with friends. And I would say taking away phone privileges. And this can happen in middle school too. Do you remember any of those things happening, Maggie?
Yeah, I remember being grounded, but you're allowed to go to work if you have a job, always work and school. And if you, going back to how you're saying, if you sign up for gymnastics or soccer, you can't quit. So any priorities you have, you go to those, but no additional fun activities. So you can't go to your friend's house, your friends are all getting ice cream, and you can't go this time. And normally for me, it would last like a week. And this also didn't happen often. I wasn't getting in huge trouble frequently, or otherwise I think getting grounded would also lose its meaning if it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
So this would happen like maybe once a year and for a week, but I never had to miss like a big fundamental moment that would make a core memory, like a homecoming or a soccer tournament. Mm-hmm. But it was just like the fun weekend activity that I wanted to do.
Yeah, and I've heard parents talk about the phone and taking away the phone, and it's like, oh, we can't do that because, name your excuse. But parents, you can. I've heard kids say, they can't take away my phone, it's my phone. But it's not your phone. For most families, the parents are paying that phone bill. It's the parent's phone, and the kid has the privilege of using the phone. So don't be afraid to wield that discipline, especially because you need to find something important to the child that you can remove as a form of discipline.
Yeah.
So one more piece of advice that, again, I read about this wasn't my original idea, but it really worked well for our family, is being on the same page with your spouse. So I think that's something that's hugely important, because I know I did this when I was a teenager. I would try to play mom against dad, and I think I did so pretty effectively from time to time, but you don't want your children to do that. So even if mom and dad maybe aren't completely on the same page, get on the same page before you talk to your child about what a punishment is, if it's a big one, or even just saying yes to things. So our practice was that the kids would come and ask us to do something, like maybe go to a party, or maybe go, on a road trip with friends and someone just got their license, for example. Those are questions that we were asked and we weren't really sure how to respond in the moment. So I would say, Dad and I are going to talk about this and we'll get back to you. And we would get back to them that day, later that night when my husband and I had a chance to talk to each other. So get on the same page. That doesn't mean if there's a minor infraction, mom or dad handle it, it'd be immediate. But if it's something bigger that you haven't faced before as parents, especially with your first child, don't be afraid to tell your child, Dad and I are going to talk about this and get back to you. Do you remember us doing that?
Yeah, and I think it really helps with the consistency and knowing that we shouldn't then go ask the other parent or figure because you're going to talk about it. So it really breaks that cycle that I think kids get into of if one parent says no, then just go ask the other parent.
Yep. So lastly, I want to talk about kind of natural consequences. So there are things that aren't necessarily discipline, but letting the natural consequence of something play out. So for example, if you forget to take your lunch to school, maybe, and the child texts you, Mom, I forgot my lunch. Maybe if I'm available, I'll bring it once, but then after that, sorry kid, you've got to buy your lunch, even if you don't like what's for lunch. Mm-hmm. Or you forgot to turn in your homework. That one's a little easier because the teacher's going to take care of that. And so this is where reinforcing your family values, the teachers are often going to follow a similar mantra. Or you didn't charge your phone and, Mom, you get a text, can you bring my charger? Sorry, you're going to have to deal with it. So were you ever in that situation, Maggie, where you remember that you had to deal with those natural consequences of your actions?
Yeah, all through the examples you said. And then I think then when you do ask and it was delivered, like to school, I forgot my cleats or I forgot my lunch and it was delivered, it was more like exciting, like thank you so much for delivering it, instead of the one time you don't deliver it and I'm like mad at you or think you're in the wrong when it was my fault.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are all really good examples, and you have to forget it sometimes and not receive it to learn to not forget it again.
Right. If the parents are always coming to your rescue, you're never going to learn the value of the natural consequence. Mm-hmm. You're never going to say, before bed, I need to make sure my phone is plugged in so it's fully charged when I go to school. Or I remember Sarah had a mnemonic that she would create when she was going off to practice, so she remembered her cleats, her shin guard, her water bottle, mm-hmm. because she was very forgetful, and we would get to practice and she didn't have her cleats. So, all right, Maggie, lightning round.
Okay.
Complete the sentence.
Okay.
And this is related to discipline. I hated it when
I had to sit on the stairs at a friend's house.
Really embarrassing.
Very.
The punishment I deserved was...
I think that sledding one was a great story. I deserved that. You shouldn't hit your sibling. You shouldn't hit anybody with your sleds. So I deserved that one. And eventually I was allowed to go play again. So it wasn't too much.
Okay, I'm ready for the truth here. How about this one? The punishment I didn't deserve.
Oh. There was one time growing up where I had this blanket I really liked, and it had these like tags on it that were sewn on. They were like ribbons. And one time one came off and I was so sad, and I got punished for taking it off. Or was it Sarah's?
It was Sarah's.
My sister's blanket. One of them got ripped off, one of the ribbons, and I got in trouble for it for a long time because Sarah blamed it on me. Mm-hmm. And I was like 1 or 2 years old, so I was not old enough to defend myself. And then like years later, Sarah revealed that it was her. She cut it off and blamed me. So
yeah.
I did not deserve that punishment.
No, you did not. And I felt really bad about that. But at the time, I had to trust her. And yeah, that didn't represent our faith or family well in that activity. One rule I'll absolutely have for my own kids.
We had a rule growing up where until like maybe high school, maybe even middle school, when we had an iPod, an iPad, and then the start of having a phone, we had to leave it downstairs when we would go to bed. And you couldn't go back downstairs and get it. You wouldn't have it until the morning. We had an alarm clock that was a physical clock. So when we went upstairs, you just had to read a book or rest or like talk to each other for a little bit before you go to sleep, which I think it really is important to take that phone away at night because kids can get into the habit. I know we all can do it where you're scrolling, you stay up really late. And I think it's just important when you're young to read and get creative in that mindset. So I liked the idea of plugging those electronics in downstairs till a certain age.
I am so relieved to hear that. And I bet a lot of parents watching or listening will be relieved to hear that looking back in hindsight, that you value that decision we made at the time because, yeah, it's hard to take phones away from kids. And it was not easy for us to do that either. I mean, we lost our cool sometimes enforcing that family rule that the phones have to be plugged in downstairs. But I think you slept better.
Yeah.
It gave you a chance to read or just...
And it started when we were even younger than 13 with iPod touches or iPads that we were allowed to use during the day.
So Maggie, in hindsight, what's one thing you wish parents understood about discipline coming from the child's perspective?
I think everything we've been saying today has been really important, and I think the most important lesson for parents is just to be consistent with your parenting partner, to be consistent with your children, to be consistent with your family values so that the child knows why they need to act a certain way because that's what your family believes in and why you believe in it. So I think overall consistency is the most important factor before discipline.
I love that. And I would kind of echo that a bit. And I would say kids don't need perfect parents. None of us are perfect, but they need predictable parents. So one thing that I would suggest for families to do this week that you can start now is parents get on the same page with each other. Sit down with your spouse or your significant other and have a conversation about, this week we're going to try being on the same page when it comes to discipline or even just helping our children to make big decisions. I think that's something you can put into practice immediately. So thanks for joining us for today's episode of Parenting in Hindsight. Please like or share. We're glad you joined us. And remember that the lessons may come in hindsight, but the connections with your children starts today.